My name is Ethan, and I'll never forget the moment my mother looked across the Christmas dinner table, her voice sharp enough to cut through the sound of clinking glasses and quiet laughter, and said, "You are the most useless child we have." The room went silent. Forks froze in midair, wine glasses stopped halfway to lips. I felt every eye land on me as though I had been placed under a spotlight in my own family's courtroom. I was 32 years old, sitting in the very house I'd grown up in, a house filled with traditions and ornaments that had survived decades, yet, at that moment, I felt like I didn't belong to it at all. I'd come with my arms full of carefully wrapped gifts, with news I had been saving for weeks. News that was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter. Just last month, my girlfriend and I had gotten engaged. The ring was tucked safely in my pocket, waiting for the right moment. And earlier that year, after 3 relentless years of overtime and proving myself, I had earned a major promotion at work. I walked into that house believing foolishly perhaps that this Christmas would finally be different, that maybe my mother would look at me with pride. Instead, with one sentence, she crushed that hope. I can still see the details of that evening as if they were carved into my memory. The dining room table set with fine china we only used twice a year, the golden light of the chandelier bouncing off crystal glasses, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon rolls, drifting from the kitchen, mixing with the faint scent of pine from the tree in the living room. All of it should have felt warm, familiar, comforting. But under my mother's gaze, under her words, the entire room became hostile terrain. My father sat at the far end, his jaw tightening, but his mouth staying shut as it had so many times before. My older brother, the doctor, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. My younger sister, the lawyer, smirked faintly into her wine glass, as though she had been expecting this. The rest of the family, cousins, aunts, uncles, watched with stunned silence, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard. And me. For the first time in my life, I didn't shrink into myself. Something inside me hardened. Decades of swallowing words, of being the overlooked middle child, of fighting for scraps of acknowledgement, everything coiled tight inside my chest and demanded release. I remember thinking, not this time, not anymore. But before I tell you what happened next, I need to pause here. Because this story isn't just about that single dinner. It's about a lifetime that led up to that moment. A lifetime of comparisons, sacrifices, and hidden truths that none of them ever saw. It's about what happens when the quiet one, the so-called useless one, finally speaks. And let me tell you, when I finally opened my mouth, the shock on my mother's face was worth every year of silence. That was the beginning. But before I dive deeper into what unfolded that night and why it changed everything, I want to know something from you. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments below, because stories like this connect us across cities, across states, even across oceans. And if you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated in your own family, then you'll want to stay with me until the end. Because the words I spoke at that table didn't just shock my mother, they rewrote the script of my entire life. I had walked into that Christmas gathering holding on to 2 pieces of news that I thought would finally change how my family looked at me. After years of being the invisible middle child, after years of hearing about my brother's medical journals and my sister's courtroom victories, I was finally ready to stand on equal footing. I had worked my way up to a senior position at my firm, leading my own team for the first time in my career. And just 2 months earlier, the woman I loved had said yes when I asked her to marry me. I carried those moments inside me like treasures. But the moment my mother's words, "the most useless child we have," landed across the table, I knew those treasures would never mean anything to her. Still, I had to tell them. My father deserved to know. My grandmother, who had always been quietly supportive, deserved to see her grandson proud. So during a brief pause in the dinner conversation, I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. Actually, I said, I've been meaning to share some exciting news with everyone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small velvet box. The room's energy shifted just slightly, as if a ripple of curiosity had passed through. I got promoted last month, senior marketing coordinator, and I opened the box, the ring catching the light from the chandelier. I'm engaged. We're getting married. For one fragile second, I thought it might work. My father's face softened into a proud smile, my grandmother's eyes filled with tears, and even my aunt whispered a quiet, "Congratulations." But the moment was crushed almost instantly. My sister leaned back, tilting her head like she was evaluating a case file. 2 months. You didn't think to tell us sooner. My brother muttered something about teachers not making much money when I reminded them what my fiancé did for a living. And then my mother with a shrug that felt like a knife October. You hid this for 2 months. Typical of you, always secretive, always keeping us in the dark. Secretive. The word stung. I wasn't secretive. I called her every week. I remembered birthdays. I showed up to help when nobody else did. But in that moment, nothing I'd ever done mattered. I could feel my palms sweating under the table. My fork trembled in my hand, and I tried to smile, as if her words didn't dig into me. But inside a storm was forming. I wanted to yell to demand why nothing I accomplished was ever enough. Instead, I whispered, I wanted to tell you in person. I wanted this to be special. Special, she scoffed. You're 32. You live in a tiny apartment. Your career barely pays the bills. What's so special about that? The laughter and chatter around the table evaporated. My father set his wine glass down with a heavy clink. My grandmother's hand froze halfway to her mouth. Even my cousins looked up from their phones, sensing that something sharp had just sliced through the room. I stared at her, stunned. For years, I had absorbed her words like punches, retreating quietly and hoping one day she'd see me differently. But hearing her tear apart, not just me, but also the man who loved me, the life I was building, something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to let her strip the joy out of the happiest news I'd ever had. And yet, as much as anger rose in me, another voice whispered, This is your family. If you explode now, you'll lose them forever. So I forced myself to sit still, to wait, to hold my truth until the right moment. Because I knew that when I finally spoke, I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to expose the entire history they had conveniently ignored. I looked around the table, my brother smirking into his phone, my sister sipping her wine like she was above it all, my mother glowing with the same superiority I had grown up beneath. And I thought, they really have no idea who I am or what I've done for them. That was when the decision crystallized. I would not let my engagement, my promotion, my very worth be trampled without a fight. The years of quiet endurance were over. But before I stood up, before I revealed the truth that would shatter the perfect image of this family, I took one last look at my grandmother. She was watching me closely, her eyes saying what her lips didn't dare speak. Say it. It's time. And deep down, I knew she was right. I grew up as the middle child, which in my house meant being invisible. My older brother Ryan was the golden boy from the day he was born. He could bring home a report card filled with B's, and my mother would gush about his natural brilliance. When he grew up and became a doctor, it was like the family had won the lottery. Every gathering turned into a celebration of Ryan's success. My younger sister Chloe was the baby, the delicate princess who was endlessly excused for her behavior. If she threw a tantrum, it was considered expressing herself. If she broke a lamp, it was because she was spirited. And then there was me. From as early as I can remember, I understood that if I wanted even a sliver of my parents' attention, I had to work twice as hard. Straight A's were the only option, not because I was naturally gifted, but because I believed excellence was the only way to be seen. When I came home with perfect grades, my mom's response was a quick nod followed by, "That's nice. Did you hear Ryan just got published in another journal, or Chloe's dance recital is next week? We're so proud of her." I spent my high school years juggling part-time jobs, bagging groceries, tutoring younger kids. Not because we needed the money, but because I thought maybe, just maybe if I could show I was contributing, they would finally see me. Every paycheck went toward gifts for my parents. I bought my mom flowers on Mother's Day jewelry for her birthday, thoughtful Christmas presents I saved up for months. Ryan and Chloe. They would grab something last minute from the mall, but somehow their gifts always earned the biggest smiles, the warmest hugs. Mine were sweet, but quickly forgotten. College was supposed to be my clean slate. I chose marketing because I loved the blend of creativity and strategy, how ideas could move people to action. I was excited, energized, certain I had found my place. But when I announced my choice, my mother's face fell as though I had told her I was dropping out. Marketing. That's not a real career. That's just playing with pretty pictures. Her words burned into me. Why can't you be more like Ryan helping people, or like Chloe using real intelligence to make a difference? I swallowed that sting and kept going. I graduated with honors, landed my first job, stayed late, came in early, did everything to prove myself. Every time I succeeded, I'd call home, my voice bubbling with excitement, hoping that maybe this time I'd hear something different. But the conversations always ended the same. That's nice, dear. Did I tell you about Ryan's new research, or Chloe just won another case at the firm? Over time, I learned that being the middle child meant being the family's shadow. I wasn't the star or the darling, I was the filler between two shining portraits. Family dinners became survival tests, me smiling politely, while the spotlight swung back and forth between Ryan and Chloe. My role was to nod, to clap, to pretend I wasn't aching inside. And yet I still tried. I wanted their approval so badly that I gave and gave until I had nothing left for myself. I drove hours to help my parents move into their new house, spending my entire vacation painting walls, while Ryan was too busy and Chloe was in court. I dog-sat their German Shepherd for weekends, even though I'm allergic, and spent days sneezing my lungs out. When my dad had emergency surgery, I was the one who sat with my mom for 6 hours, comforting her in the waiting room. And what did I get in return? A lecture afterward about how I should have called Ryan and Chloe more often with updates. It didn't matter what I did. I was never enough. And maybe that's why at that Christmas dinner years later, when my mother looked at me with that same dismissive gaze and called me useless, something inside me finally snapped. It wasn't just about that one comment. It was about a lifetime of being overlooked, dismissed, and diminished. It was about every ignored gift, every minimized achievement. Every night I cried myself to sleep, wondering what was wrong with me. I had spent decades trying to prove my worth. And now, as I sat there with an engagement ring in my pocket and a promotion under my belt, I realized I didn't need to prove anything anymore. But before I tell you what happened when I finally stood up for myself, let me ask you, have you ever been the invisible one? The person who gave everything only to be treated as if you didn't matter? Share your story in the comments, because I know I'm not the only one who has lived in someone else's shadow. Because what I said next would tear down years of silence and leave my mother stunned into a silence of her own. If you've ever lived in a family where love felt like a competition, you'll understand what I'm about to say. For me, the unfairness wasn't about one single moment. It was about the thousands of little cuts over the years, each one sharp enough to leave a scar. And together they formed a lifetime of feeling like I was always second best or maybe third best, depending on the day. When Ryan forgot to call home on Mom's birthday, it was excused. He's busy saving lives at the hospital. When Chloe missed family dinners because she was preparing for trial, it was excused. She's carving out her place in the legal world. But if I showed up 10 minutes late because traffic on I-95 was jammed, my mother would narrow her eyes and hiss, "You never respect anyone's time." I spent hours handcrafting gifts, pouring my heart into them. One year, I created a custom scrapbook of family photos, scanning and restoring dozens of old pictures. It took me nearly 40 hours. When I handed it over, my mom flipped through a few pages, smiled politely, and set it aside. Meanwhile, Chloe handed her a luxury gift card she'd bought that morning, and my mom beamed as though she'd been given the crown jewels. That was the rhythm of my life. My efforts were invisible, their efforts magnified. I cooked meals when my parents were overwhelmed. I babysat cousins at short notice. I filled in every gap no one else wanted to touch. And yet the spotlight always found my siblings. I was the scaffolding that held the structure, but they were the ones praised for how tall the building stood. The harshest memories weren't just about gifts or dinners. They were about how every conversation seemed to circle back to how much more successful Ryan and Chloe were. I'd share a small victory, a new client at work, a project that exceeded expectations. And before the words even left my lips, my mom would cut in, "That's nice, dear. But did you know Ryan was invited to speak at a conference? Or Chloe just closed a 6-figure settlement?" I smiled through it all. But deep down, the message was clear. I was trying, but my trying didn't matter. Even when emergencies came, the same pattern played out. When Dad needed surgery, I rearranged my schedule, drove him to appointments, sat with Mom in the waiting room. Ryan was in surgery himself. Chloe was in court. But afterward, I wasn't thanked for stepping up. Instead, I was scolded, "You should have updated them more often." That was my role. to carry the weight silently while they collected the praise. What hurt most wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the constant comparisons. My mother's words drilled into me again and again. Why can't you be more like Ryan? Why can't you be more like Chloe? As if my own path marketing creativity strategy wasn't real work. As if I was wasting time playing with slogans while they changed the world. But here's the truth I didn't see back then. I was changing the world in smaller ways. Every client I helped, every campaign that told a story, people connected with every job I took on to ease the family's burden. That was impact too. I just hadn't learned to value it because no one else in my family ever did. And that Christmas night, when my mother once again shoved me into the shadow of my siblings, all of those years of injustice boiled to the surface. It wasn't just about being called useless at the table. It was about every time my contributions were dismissed, every time my sacrifices were treated like obligations instead of gifts. I'd been swallowing my voice for 3 decades. But the truth has a way of building pressure like water behind a dam. And when the dam finally breaks, the flood is unstoppable. I looked around the table that night and realized something important. They had no idea what I'd done for them. They had no idea how much of myself I'd given. And they would never know unless I told them. And that's what I want to ask you right now. Have you ever carried the invisible load for everyone else, watching others take the credit while you stayed silent? Tell me in the comments, because if you felt that weight, you'll understand why I finally stood up. Because what I revealed to my family that night didn't just shock them. It shattered the story they'd been telling themselves for years. There's a cruel kind of silence that fills a room when you finally decide you're done swallowing your pride. That night, after my mother's words, I sat there staring at the golden turkey, my chest tightening, my fork trembling in my hand. And for the first time, I didn't retreat. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady, and said, "Do you even know what I've given up for this family?" The room froze. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for me to shrink back, to laugh it off like I always had. But I didn't. The words started spilling out, decades of them, sharp, jagged, unstoppable. I told them about the job offer in Seattle that I turned down when Dad's heart condition worsened. It was a position that would have doubled my salary, a dream opportunity. But I stayed because Mom had begged, "We need you close." Ryan was in residency, Chloe was in law school, so the responsibility fell to me, and I carried it without complaint. Then I reminded them about the loan I quietly co-signed for Chloe when her tuition costs nearly buried her. She never even mentioned it afterward, never told anyone I saved her from default. She wore her success like a badge, but part of that badge was pinned with my sacrifice. And Ryan, he wouldn't even be a doctor if it weren't for me. I worked 2 part-time jobs during college to help cover the rent we shared. He was drowning under labs and rotations, and I picked up the slack, never asking for thanks. I looked directly at my mother then. Useless, I've been the scaffolding for this family while you put them on pedestals. No one spoke, not a word. Even my aunt, who never stopped talking, pressed her lips tight and glanced at the floor. The only sound was the faint hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. And then my sister tried to laugh it off, a nervous, brittle sound. "You're exaggerating, Ethan." That laugh, that dismissal, was the spark. My voice rose firmer now, echoing off the walls. Exaggerating. You know I drained half my savings when Mom's roof started leaking. You know I drove 4 hours in the middle of the night when Ryan's car broke down, just so he could make it to an exam the next morning. I've been there for every one of you, every single time, and still, I sit here being called useless. I could see the cracks forming. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his fork clinking against the plate. Chloe's smirk faded, replaced with something closer to guilt. My father rubbed his forehead, his silence suddenly unbearable. For 30 years, my family's narrative had been clear: Ryan the savior, Chloe the star, and me, the afterthought. But in that moment, I ripped the curtain back, forcing them to look at the truth they'd ignored. I wasn't useless. I was the backbone they leaned on without ever acknowledging. And here's the strange part: instead of feeling ashamed, I felt lighter. Every word I spoke peeled away years of resentment I hadn't even realized I carried. I looked around the table, my voice calmer now, almost sad. You think you know who I am, but you've never looked closely enough. Maybe it's easier for you to believe I'm nothing, because then you don't have to feel guilty about how much I've given. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't dismissive. It was heavy, suffocating, like they finally realized I wasn't bluffing. And you watching this, listening right now, I want to know, have you ever had to remind people of your worth? Did you ever reach that breaking point where silence felt heavier than the risk of speaking up? Share it in the comments. Because the truth is, most of us carry invisible sacrifices, and sometimes the only way to be seen is to force people to open their eyes. That night, I thought my words would fall flat, ignored like always. But I was wrong. What happened next proved that when you finally shatter the silence, you also shatter the control people think they have over your story. The words I had just spoken hung in the air like shattered glass, sharp and impossible to ignore. I thought just maybe my confession would spark an apology, or at least a moment of recognition. Instead, Chloe slammed her wine glass onto the table, her voice dripping with disdain. "Oh, please, Ethan, stop acting like a martyr. Everyone sacrifices for this family. You're not special." Her words were like gasoline on a fire. I felt the heat rising in my chest again, my knuckles tightening against the wooden table. For years I had let her cut me down with little jabs disguised as jokes, polished with lawyerly precision. But tonight, I wasn't letting it slide. "Not special?" I shot back. "You think covering for your late rent wasn't special? You think driving 3 hours at 2 a.m. to bail you out when you got that speeding ticket wasn't special? You think protecting your reputation when you almost lost your internship because you skipped out on assignments wasn't special?" Her face paled, and I could tell she didn't expect me to air her secrets in front of the family. The smirk she wore so comfortably was gone, replaced with a tight-lipped glare. Ryan cleared his throat, trying to play peacemaker as always. "Look, Ethan, maybe this isn't the time." I turned to him, my voice slicing through his hesitation. "Not the time, Ryan. You've lived your entire life believing you're the crown jewel because you wear a white coat. But who sat with Dad during his surgeries when you were too busy studying? Who worked double shifts so you didn't have to quit school when money got tight? You've reaped the glory, but you never once admitted you didn't do it alone." His fork clattered against the plate. His shoulders sagged, and for once he didn't have a quick defense. I could feel the tide shifting. Years of silence had made me invisible to them, but my voice, now raw, unflinching, made it impossible for them to pretend I didn't matter. And yet, even as I spoke, guilt tangled with my anger. I hated dragging their secrets into the open. I hated sounding bitter. But what other choice did I have? They'd written me into the role of useless, and I was rewriting it line by line. My mother's face reddened. "Enough, Ethan," she hissed. "You're ruining Christmas." That sentence broke something inside me. Ruining Christmas. As though the holiday with its glittering lights and carefully curated perfection mattered more than the truth of her son's life. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound was jarring, final. "You ruined Christmas the moment you decided to humiliate me in front of everyone. Don't you dare pretend I'm the one tearing this family apart." The silence afterward was suffocating. My cousins avoided eye contact, staring at their plates as though they could vanish into the mashed potatoes. My father, still wordless, looked older than I'd ever seen him. For a moment, I almost sat back down, swallowed the fire again. But then I realized this was the only chance I had to finally be seen, so I stayed standing. And here's the thing I want to ask you. Have you ever been told you were ruining the moment just because you dared to speak the truth? If you have, drop a comment. Because I'm telling you right now, it's not you who ruins the moment. It's the lie that ruins it, and the courage to expose that lie is never the villain. That night, I didn't know how my family would recover. I didn't know if I'd just set fire to every bridge between us. But one thing became clear as I stood there unflinching under their stares for the first time in my life. I wasn't invisible. And once you taste that kind of freedom, the freedom of being unapologetically seen, you can't go back to silence. When I walked out of that dining room, the December air slapped me across the face, cold and bracing. For a few minutes, I just stood on the porch, staring at the twinkling Christmas lights strung across the neighbors' houses. It was surreal inside. My family was frozen in silence. But out here, the world carried on as if nothing had happened. Couples walked their dogs, kids dragged sleds across the icy sidewalk. Carols drifted faintly from a nearby radio. For the first time in my life, I felt detached from it all. Detached, but strangely liberated. I sat on the steps, my breath fogging in the night air. My hands shook, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I'd finally spoken the truth I had buried for years, and though it scorched the room behind me, it also lit something inside me I hadn't known was still alive. That was when my father followed me out. His footsteps were slow, hesitant. He eased himself down onto the step beside me, his joints stiff, his face pale under the porch light. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Just the sound of the wind whistling through the bare branches above. Finally, he sighed. "You didn't have to say all that," he murmured. My chest tightened. "Didn't I? You all sat there while Mom called me useless. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said a word." He rubbed his hands together, staring at the ground. "You don't understand. Keeping the peace matters in this family." I laughed bitterly. Peace. You call it peace when I'm the one absorbing the hits so no one else has to feel uncomfortable. That's not peace, Dad. That's a prison. His silence was answer enough. He had no argument, just a lifetime of habit of looking the other way. And in that moment, I realized something painful. Maybe my father wasn't malicious. Maybe he wasn't even blind. He was simply weak. He had chosen quiet compliance over the messy cost of defending his son. I turned to him, my voice softer now but resolute. "I've spent 30 years earning a place in this family. But the truth is, I don't need it anymore. I don't need validation from people who only remember me when they need saving. I'm done, Dad." He looked at me startled as though I'd spoken a foreign language. His lips parted, but no words came. I stood up, brushing snow off my coat. For once, I wasn't trembling with fear of being abandoned. I was steady, almost calm. "Tell Mom and the others I said goodnight," I said. And with that, I walked down the steps, leaving the glow of the Christmas lights behind me. I didn't know it then, but that walk down the quiet suburban street was the start of something bigger than a family feud. It was the beginning of reclaiming my life. And if you've ever been in that position, torn between keeping the so-called peace and finally choosing yourself, you know how terrifying it feels. But you also know the strange relief that comes after. 'Cause here's the truth, silence doesn't keep peace. It just keeps wounds hidden. Later that night, as I drove home through the snow, I glanced at the reflection of myself in the car window. For the first time, I didn't see the useless son. I saw a man who had finally chosen freedom over approval. That's when I whispered to myself, "There's no going back now." And I meant it. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked into my apartment later that night, the silence wrapping around me like an unfamiliar but welcome blanket. No bickering voices, no judgmental stares, no mother's sharp tongue cutting me down. Just the hum of the radiator and the faint glow of the street lamp outside my window. For years I'd dreaded this kind of quiet. It felt like loneliness, a punishment for not being enough. But now it felt like the first breath after being underwater too long. I hung up my coat and sat on the worn couch staring at the framed photos on the wall. Old pictures of me with friends, coworkers, even the softball team I'd joined years ago. In those photos, I was smiling, not the forced grin I wore at family dinners, but the kind that came naturally when you felt seen. I realized something that night. Maybe I'd been chasing acceptance from the wrong people all along. Still, doubts crept in. The words useless echoed in my head like a stubborn echo. Could I really undo decades of conditioning with just one outburst at Christmas dinner? Could I truly step into a life where I no longer begged for scraps of recognition? The knock on my door startled me. When I opened it, my cousin Emma stood there, her cheeks pink from the cold. She slipped inside, brushing snow from her scarf. "I just wanted to check on you," she said softly. "What you did back there, it was brave." Her words stunned me. Brave I had felt anything but. I told her as much and she shook her head. "No, Ethan. You said what we've all been too scared to say. Aunt Linda's harshness, the way Chloe and Ryan act superior, it's not just you. We've all felt it. But you were the only one who had the guts to call it out." I stared at her, floored. For years I'd believed I was the family's punching bag, carrying that burden alone. But Emma's words cracked open a truth I hadn't considered. Maybe my rebellion wasn't just mine. Maybe it was a spark others needed too. She squeezed my shoulder before leaving. "Don't let them convince you that you ruined anything. You gave us a mirror. Whether they look into it or not, that's their choice." After she left, I sat back down, her words circling in my mind. For the first time, I wasn't just questioning the narrative I'd been handed. I was rewriting it. I thought about all the years I'd sacrificed, covering bills, fixing problems, swallowing insults, and how none of it had earned me respect. But maybe that was the point. Respect couldn't be bargained for or guilted out of people. It had to be claimed. That night I opened my laptop and began writing not to them but to myself. A kind of manifesto. I am not useless. I am not invisible. My worth is not measured by their approval. I am whole even when I stand alone. I typed the words over and over until the sting of useless began to fade, replaced by something sturdier: conviction. And that's the thing I want you to sit with tonight. Sometimes the family you're born into is not the family that sees you. And that's okay. You get to build your own circle of people who value your presence, not just your sacrifices. If this hits home, don't just watch silently, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you most? Because you're not alone in that choice, and saying it out loud might just be your first step toward freedom. As I shut my laptop, the apartment was still quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like possibility. And possibility, I realized, is louder than any insult could ever be. The next morning, sunlight streamed through my blinds, cutting across the room in golden stripes. I blinked awake, half expecting a flood of regret to wash over me, but it didn't. Instead, there was a stillness inside me, like I'd set down a heavy suitcase I'd carried for decades. I brewed a pot of coffee, letting the aroma fill the apartment. My phone buzzed on the counter screen, lighting up with missed calls and unread messages, half from my mother, the other half from my sister Chloe. I didn't open them. Not yet. I wasn't ready to let their voices back in, not when I'd just begun to hear my own clearly. Instead, I sat at the table with my mug, staring out the window as the world woke up: kids throwing snowballs, neighbors shoveling driveways, the postman trudging through the cold. It struck me, life moved on. The world didn't collapse because I walked out of Christmas dinner, and maybe my world wouldn't collapse either. But then came the email. It was from my job, an invitation to present at an upcoming industry conference, a chance to stand in front of hundreds of peers and speak on a project I had poured months of work into. For once, recognition wasn't coming from family politics. It was coming from a place where my effort actually mattered. I felt a swell of pride, followed quickly by fear. What if I wasn't enough? What if I stumbled and the audience saw me the way my mother did: useless? That word still clung to me like smoke after a fire. I set the laptop aside, pacing the living room. Somewhere between my mother's biting words and this new opportunity, I found myself at a crossroads. And maybe you've been there too, standing between the voice that tells you you're nothing and the possibility that you could be everything you were meant to be. I realized the real question wasn't, what if I fail? It was, what if I never try? And here's where I want to pause and whisper something directly to you. If you've ever carried that same doubt, you are not alone. Too many of us let one cruel word define decades of our lives. But what if we chose differently right now? What if we stepped into the unknown, even trembling, even afraid? Tell me in the comments. What's the one voice in your life you're still trying to silence? Sharing it might just loosen its grip. Later that afternoon, I finally opened Chloe's messages. As expected, they were laced with guilt. You ruined Christmas. Mom hasn't stopped crying. Everyone's upset with you. Can't you just apologize and make things right? I stared at her words, the old reflex kicking in: apologize, smooth things over, make myself small to restore their version of peace. But then I thought about the conference, about the chance to stand tall in front of strangers who didn't see me as a disappointment, but as someone worth listening to. And for the first time, I typed back just 2 words: not this time. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. And with that, something inside me shifted. A door that had always been closed cracked open, and light spilled through. That night, I pinned the conference email to my corkboard right above the manifesto I'd written the night before. Side by side, they told a story of who I'd been and who I was becoming. And I knew then with startling clarity walking out of that dinner wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the chapter where I finally claimed my own voice. The week leading up to the conference felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into an ocean of possibilities. Every morning, I'd wake with my heart pounding, torn between excitement and the gnawing fear that I'd fall flat on my face. I spent hours rehearsing my talk in front of the mirror. At first, my voice trembled, every sentence cracking under the weight of doubt. I could almost hear my mother's sneer in the background. "Who do you think you are, Ethan? No one wants to hear from you." But with each run-through, something inside me began to shift. My words steadied. My shoulders straightened. I wasn't just reciting slides, I was telling a story. the story of a project I had carried from sketch to reality, pouring every ounce of effort into it. A story of resilience. By the third night of practice, I realized I was no longer trying to silence my mother's voice. I was replacing it with my own. Still, temptation lurked. My phone buzzed with another message from Chloe. Mom says she'll forgive you if you come over this weekend and apologize. Please don't drag this out. You don't want to be the reason our family falls apart. For years, that kind of plea would have broken me. I would have caved, shoulders bowed, whispering sorry just to stop the storm. But now I read it with new eyes. Wasn't it ironic? The family that accused me of ruining everything was the same family that had been fracturing me for decades. This time I didn't reply. I tucked the phone away, choosing silence over submission. 2 days before the conference, something unexpected happened. Emma stopped by again, holding a folder. She smiled sheepishly. I thought you might need a second set of ears. Inside the folder were notes, her feedback on my presentation. Pages of encouragement, practical tips, and at the bottom a handwritten line. You've got this. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. That single sentence hit me harder than all the criticism I'd ever endured. For the first time, I felt what unconditional support looked like, quiet, steady, and real. I invited her in, and we spent hours running through the slides. Whenever I stumbled, she didn't laugh or roll her eyes. She simply asked, "How can you explain it clearer?" No judgment, just belief. And that's when it clicked. Maybe family wasn't about blood at all. Maybe it was about the people who chose to stand with you when you doubted yourself most. The night before the conference, sleep refused to come. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, imagining the room filled with strangers' faces. My palms sweated just at the thought. But then I remembered something I'd once heard: courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to move forward despite it. So I whispered into the dark, I'm ready. Even if my voice shakes, I'm ready. And here's where I want to turn to you, the one listening right now. What's your conference? It might not be a stage with a microphone. It could be a conversation you've been avoiding, a project you've been afraid to start, a truth you've been terrified to admit. Don't let fear trick you into silence. Write it down, share it, take one step toward it. Because when you do, you'll realize the chains holding you were never locked. When morning finally came, I slipped on my suit, adjusted my tie, and caught my reflection in the mirror. For once, I didn't see useless. I saw a man carrying both scars and strength, ready to let the world see him as he truly was. And as I picked up the folder Emma left me, I whispered again, I've got this. Not because my mother believed in me, not because my sister forgave me, but because at long last, I believed in myself. The morning of the conference was wrapped in a thin mist, the kind that makes the city look like it's holding its breath. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. Every red light felt like a test. Every turn, a question. Are you sure you're ready for this? By the time I arrived at the hotel where the event was held, my heart was racing so fast, I thought the security guard might hear it thumping through my chest. The lobby buzzed with voices, laughter, and the rhythmic clinking of coffee cups. People in tailored suits moved with ease, their badges swinging from lanyards like little flags of confidence. And then there was me, Ethan, the so-called useless one, the son who had been told his voice didn't matter. But I walked forward anyway. Inside the ballroom, rows of chairs stretched out before the stage. A massive screen glowed with the conference logo. I found my seat among the speakers, sliding into the silence of my own thoughts. I rehearsed the opening line over and over in my head until the words began to blur. When they finally called my name, it was like stepping off a cliff. The applause washed over me, polite but expectant. My legs moved almost on instinct, carrying me up to the podium. The microphone loomed like an adversary, daring me to falter. I cleared my throat. My voice shook at first, but then I remembered Emma's note. You've got this. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. So I began not with statistics or jargon, but with a story. My name is Ethan, I said, steadying my breath, and for years people told me I had nothing worth saying, that I was wasting my time, that I didn't matter. But today I want to show you what happens when you stop believing the voices that try to shrink you. The room went still. Dozens of eyes locked on me, waiting. And with that, I launched into the story of the project, how it began as a sketch on a napkin, how it almost collapsed under funding cuts, how I stayed up nights soldering pieces together by hand. I showed them not just the polished result, but the bruises and failures along the way. Something magical happened. People leaned forward. They nodded. They scribbled notes. The fear that had wrapped itself around my chest began to dissolve, replaced by something new connection. And when I revealed the breakthrough the moment the design finally worked after weeks of failure, the room erupted in applause. Not polite applause this time, genuine, sustained, alive. I paused, letting it sink in, and that's when the tears threatened to rise. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just heard, I was understood. When I walked off the stage, the event organizer clapped me on the shoulder. "That was phenomenal," he said. "Raw, honest, exactly what people needed to hear." Phenomenal, a word I had never once heard from my family. I slipped into the hallway, needing air. My phone buzzed with a new message from Chloe. "Mom says you embarrassed us enough already. Don't think this changes anything." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then for the first time I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I didn't even feel anger, just clarity. Because here's the truth, the applause of strangers meant more than the silence of blood. And to you listening right now, maybe you've been waiting for approval that will never come. Maybe you've been chasing validation from people committed to misunderstanding you. Stop. The moment you step into your own light, you'll see that you never needed their permission. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the conference in my mind. The faces, the claps, the moment my voice filled the room without breaking. And for the first time, I slept not as the forgotten son, but as someone who had finally found his place. It wasn't in the family dining room. It wasn't in their whispered judgments. It was right here, standing tall in my own truth. The morning after the conference, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, cutting lines across the newspaper I hadn't bothered to read. My mind replayed every moment from the night before the applause. The faces lit with curiosity, the organizer's hand on my shoulder. It should have felt like victory. It did feel like victory. But under it all, there was a faint ache, a reminder that my family's silence echoed louder than any ovation. That's when the phone rang. It was Chloe. Her voice was sharp, rehearsed. "You think standing on some stage makes you special? You humiliated us. You embarrassed Mom. You're nothing but a disappointment dressed up with a microphone." I listened quiet. The old me would have tried to explain, to plead, to find some scrap of understanding in her tone. But something inside me had shifted. So I simply said, "Chloe, last night wasn't about you, or Mom, or even about me proving anything to either of you. It was about showing the world and myself that I'm not who you told me I was." Her silence was short, brittle. Then she hung up. I set the phone down, exhaling a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. And in that quiet, something became clear. My family wasn't going to change. No stage, no speech, no breakthrough would alter the narrative they clung to. If anything, my success threatened it. And yet, a part of me still longed for reconciliation. Later that week, an email appeared in my inbox. It was from a university dean who had attended the conference. He wanted me to guest lecture to share my process with students. The idea both thrilled and terrified me. Could I really stand in front of a classroom, not just once, but over and be that voice? I almost declined, but then Emma's words echoed again. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." So I said yes. Walking into that lecture hall was nothing like the polished conference ballroom. Students lounged in their seats, some tapping on laptops, others sipping energy drinks. I wondered if they would even care. But when I started telling the story, not the glossy version, but the raw, imperfect journey, they leaned in just the same. Afterward, a student approached me. She looked nervous, twisting the strap of her backpack. "Your story," she said softly, "it made me realize I'm not crazy for wanting something different than what my parents expect. Thank you." Her words struck deeper than any applause could, because in that moment, I wasn't just proving something to myself, I was passing it on. But just as the light began to grow, shadows returned. My mother posted on social media a vague but pointed message. Some people mistake pity applause for achievement. Family always knows the truth. Relatives liked and shared it. Neighbors whispered. The circle that had once been my foundation was crumbling further beneath me. And yet here's where I want you. Yes, you listening now, to pause and think. Have you ever had someone so determined to drag you back into the shadows that they'll twist any light you create? Maybe you've lived that tension, wanting to soar, but fearing the chains of those closest to you. If you have, tell me in the comments. Share your story. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from the people we wish would understand. it comes from realizing we're not alone. That night, I stood by the window watching headlights streak down the street. My reflection stared back at me, weary but steadier than before. I whispered to myself, "You've survived their silence, their ridicule, their denial. But can you survive their backlash?" Because deep down, I knew the louder my voice became, the more determined they would be to silence it. And that question, the weight of it, hung in the air like thunder before a storm. The storm I had felt brewing finally broke. It started small, subtle jabs in family group chats, messages I wasn't supposed to see but somehow always did. Then came the public posts, the whispers at community gatherings, the narrative that I was a selfish show-off who craved attention at the expense of family dignity. But the real blow came one Sunday afternoon. I had barely set my keys down when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Chloe standing there, arms folded, her eyes blazing. "You've crossed the line, Ethan," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You're dragging our family name through the mud. Do you even care what this is doing to Mom?" I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain calm. I haven't spoken her name on any stage. I've only told my story, my truth. That's all. Her laugh was cold. "Your truth, that's convenient. But everyone sees it for what it is, a pity act. A desperate attempt to make people clap for you because no one at home ever will." For a moment, her words almost pierced me. But then something strange happened. Instead of shrinking under her accusation, I felt a surge of clarity. "I don't need your applause, Chloe," I said quietly. "And I don't need Mom's. I finally understand that. Because for the first time in my life, I've seen that there's a world out there beyond this house, beyond our family drama. And in that world, my story matters." Her jaw tightened. For a flicker of a second, I thought I saw something in her eyes, fear maybe, or doubt. But she masked it quickly, spat out, "You'll regret this," and stormed out. The door slammed, but the echo lingered. That night, as I lay awake, I couldn't shake the image of Chloe's eyes, the crack in her armor. Had she recognized some truth in my words, or was it just wishful thinking? Either way, the confrontation had carved a new path in me. No longer was I desperate for their acceptance. Now I was bracing myself for their resistance. And they did resist, in ways I hadn't imagined. Rumors began to circulate in places that mattered, professional circles, not just family dinners. Invitations that once filled my inbox slowed. A mentor hinted delicately that certain voices were trying to undermine my credibility. The idea that my own blood would sabotage me in public, that cut deeper than any insult ever had. I felt myself at a crossroads. Should I fight back, call them out, expose what they were doing? Or should I keep walking, eyes fixed ahead, letting my work and my truth speak louder than their slander? I'll be honest, I didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed to defend myself. But then another thought, maybe the real victory wasn't fighting fire with fire, but refusing to let their flames consume me. And here's where I want to ask you, the one watching, listening right now. What would you have done in my place if your own family tried to dismantle everything you had built? Would you confront them publicly? Or would you choose silence and perseverance? Tell me below, I want to hear your perspective. Because in moments like these, I realized community becomes a kind of family too. Still, as the days passed, one truth became harder to ignore. This wasn't going to end with silence. Chloe's threat echoed in my ears. "You'll regret this." I had thought she meant emotionally, privately. But what if she meant something else, something larger, something more destructive? The question haunted me, and for the first time, fear began to edge out my newfound courage. Because what if the storm I thought I'd weathered was only the beginning of a far greater one? The days after Chloe's threat felt strangely quiet, too quiet, like the eerie calm before a tornado tears across the horizon. At first, I thought maybe she had just been bluffing, lashing out in anger. But then small things started happening. Subtle, almost invisible, until they piled up into something undeniable. A check from a freelance project I had completed weeks earlier never arrived. A publisher I'd been in talks with stopped answering my emails. At first, I brushed it off as bad timing, but then a colleague reached out late one night with a whispered warning. "Someone's been spreading things about you. They're saying you plagiarized, that you embellished details to make yourself look heroic." The blood drained from my face. Plagiarism. Of all accusations, that one cut deepest. My work wasn't just words on a page, it was the lived truth of everything I had fought to survive. To have it twisted into lies felt like someone stealing my very identity. I wanted to believe it wasn't Chloe. But every breadcrumb led back to her. A family friend dropping vague comments online, an anonymous forum account repeating insults I had heard her use in private. Even a rumor that I was mentally unstable, a phrase Chloe had whispered to me years ago during one of her crueler tirades. The final confirmation came in the most chilling way. One evening, exhausted from chasing down dead ends, I logged onto a live stream to connect with my growing audience. The chat was buzzing, supportive as always, until a new message flashed across the screen. Ask your sister how you got that scar. My hands froze over the keyboard. The scar on my arm was something almost no one knew about. It wasn't just a wound, it was the physical reminder of a night when everything had spiraled out of control in my family's house years ago. I had never spoken about it publicly, never even hinted at it. The only people who knew were blood. And now my sister had weaponized it. I ended the live stream early, claiming I wasn't feeling well. But inside I was trembling. Not from shame, no, that had burned out long ago. This was something else. It was the realization that Chloe wasn't just angry. She wanted to destroy me. I sat in silence that night, staring at the scar. Memories I'd buried clawed their way back, shouting voices, glass breaking, the sting of betrayal so sharp I thought it would kill me. For years I had believed if I just kept quiet, if I just carried the burden alone, I could protect what little family bond remained. But Chloe's attacks shattered that illusion. They weren't protecting me, they were silencing me. And suddenly I saw it clearly. Maybe my story was never just mine. Maybe it belonged to anyone who had been bullied into silence, who had been told their pain wasn't valid, who had scars they were too afraid to explain. That night I made a decision. I wouldn't hide anymore. The next day I drafted the most personal speech I'd ever written. Not for an audience of strangers, but for myself. For every version of me who had stayed quiet. For every person watching who might see their reflection in my scars. I was terrified, yes, but also liberated. Because once you've been exposed, there's nothing left to fear. And here's where I turn to you. If you were me, would you tell everything? Would you put the most painful parts of your life into the open, knowing it could either free you or ruin you completely? Let me know what you think, because your perspective matters here more than you realize. Still, as I rehearsed that speech alone in my apartment, I felt the storm gathering outside. Chloe's words echoed louder than ever. You'll regret this. But maybe the real regret would be staying silent. The day I finally stepped onto the stage to deliver my story, the air felt electric, charged with every unspoken memory pressing against my chest. The venue wasn't grand, just a community auditorium filled with folding chairs and dim lights. But to me, it was a battlefield. Because this wasn't about applause. It was about reclaiming my voice. I began with the scar. I rolled up my sleeve, my hand trembling only slightly, and let the audience see what Chloe had tried to weaponize. The hush in the room was absolute, so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. This scar, I said, isn't a mark of shame. It's proof that I survived. The words poured out faster than I had rehearsed. I spoke about nights filled with shouting, the gaslighting, the years of being told I was too dramatic or too weak. I laid bare the story of being cornered into silence, of being taught that protecting family meant burying the truth even when that truth was eating me alive. But then I shifted. I told them what survival had given me: clarity, empathy, and a fire that could no longer be extinguished. I told them that scars don't have to be hidden. They can be lanterns. They can guide others out of the dark. I glanced at the crowd and caught sight of a woman in the second row clutching her wrist where a faint scar peeked from beneath her sleeve. Our eyes locked, and in that instant, I wasn't just speaking my story, I was speaking ours. Later that night, the backlash began just as I had expected. Chloe unleashed a storm online. Posts, screenshots, half-truths bent into weapons. She called me a liar, a manipulator, a fraud. She tried to turn my vulnerability into humiliation. But something incredible happened. People pushed back. Strangers filled the comments, not just defending me, but sharing their own scars, their own nights of silence. It was no longer about me versus Chloe. It was a chorus of voices saying, "We're done being quiet." That was the twist Chloe never saw coming. Her attempt to destroy me became the catalyst for something bigger than either of us. The next morning, I received an email from a nonprofit that helps survivors of family abuse. They had seen the recording of my speech and wanted me to collaborate on a campaign. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, realizing something profound. Chloe might have stolen years of peace from me, but she had failed to steal my purpose. For the first time, I didn't feel like the victim of my story. I was the author. And to you listening now, I have to ask, what scars are you hiding? What truths have you been told were too shameful to share? Maybe it's time you gave yourself permission to step out of silence. Because here's what I've learned: freedom doesn't come from pretending you're unbroken. It comes from showing the world how you've been pieced back together. If you've stayed with me through this journey, thank you. Truly. Your presence here means you believe in stories that matter, not just mine, but your own too. And before you go, let me say this: don't stop here. There's another chapter waiting for you. Click on the video I've linked next, where I reveal how I turned my story into a platform that reached across the country. It's not just about me, it's about how we can all rise scarred, but stronger. Because silence is what they wanted, but connection, that's what we're taking back. When all the noise faded after the fights, the scars and the endless accusations, what remained was something I never expected: peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that blooms when you finally stop fighting to be understood by those who never intended to listen. I used to believe that family was unshakable, that no matter how much pain they caused, I had to hold on. But I've learned that true family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love, respect, and the courage to stand together even when storms come. And sometimes that means walking away from those who choose control over compassion. Now I wake up each morning lighter. I don't wait for apologies that will never come. Instead, I focus on building a life with people who see me, value me, and honor the truth of my story. My scars are no longer reminders of defeat. They are symbols of survival, of a battle I chose to end on my own terms. If you've carried wounds from your own family drama, know this: you are not alone, and you are not defined by the pain they left behind. Your story isn't about what they did to you. It's about how you rise, rebuild, and reclaim your freedom. And maybe, just maybe, your courage to break the silence will become someone else's light in the dark.